Welcome to John O'Groats, located right up on the northern coast of Scotland. This is famously one of the most northerly points on the island of Great Britain, located a whopping 876 miles from Land's End all the way down in Cornwall, one of the most southwesterly points on the British mainland, and John O'Groats' spiritual partner. Many people have made the legendary journey between Land's End and John O'Groats over the years, and it's typically this very point that marks the end of that epic cross-country voyage. This is the famous John O'Groats Signpost, one of the most elusive and sought-after landmarks in all of Britain. Erected here just a few feet from the coast in 1964, the signpost tells us just how far away we are from a number of far-flung destinations in this especially isolated part of Scotland. This is the signpost that everybody wants a picture with on completing a journey up to John O'Groats, whether they've walked or cycled all the way from Land's End, or simply got the bus from one of the nearby towns. So, let's take a look at a map of the local area to get a better idea of exactly where John O'Groats is located. As you can see, John O'Groats is positioned right on the northeastern tip of Scotland, just to the south of the Orkney Islands off the coast. But despite its fame as an extreme location, John O'Groats isn't actually the northernmost point on the island of Great Britain. It's not even the northeasternmost point on the island, with both titles taken by lesser-known destinations not too far from here. We'll talk more about that surprising fact in a moment or two, but here we can see the John O'Groats House Hotel, another icon of this location. Overlooking the sea, this classic hotel was opened in 1875, but it stands on a hugely important spot in the history of John O'Groats. The historic hotel had, rather surprisingly, lain derelict as recently as 2013, but has since triumphantly reopened for business, and is neighboured by a row of colourful Scandinavian-style houses that were added in its reopening. Now, the Scandinavian link is very important, as John O'Groats, along with the wider region of Caithness, was once effectively a part of Norway, albeit locked in a long-running sovereignty dispute with the nation of Scotland in the medieval era. We'll dive deeper into the Scandinavian heritage of John O'Groats in a little while, but the coastal settlement that we know today in fact owes its origins to a Dutchman by the name of Jan de Groot. In the 15th century, Jan de Groot is believed to have lived in a house where the John O'Groats House Hotel stands today. He settled here at the time and made a living operating ferries from the mainland over to the Orkney Islands, just 8 miles across the Pentland Firth, the stretch of water before us here. By the way, the land that you can see just on the left of your picture isn't Orkney, but rather the now uninhabited island of Stroma, which once lay on the effective border between Scotland and Norway. Again, we'll talk more about the Norwegian period of control in this region in a little while, but let's return to the story of Jan de Groot, whose name might sound rather familiar. As I'm sure you've deduced, the modern-day place name John O'Groats indeed does derive from Jan de Groot, who founded this coastal settlement with his house and ferry business. Nowadays, John O'Groats as a whole is home to roughly 300 people, most of whom live in the very small village located about a mile inland. This coastal part of John O'Groats, meanwhile, is a recently revived tourist hub, home to modern sculptures like this, known as the Nomadic Boulders. Incorporating a number of boulders washed up from the Pentland Firth, this sculpture of 2015 is just one example of how John O'Groats has seen a significant period of regeneration in recent years. As we mentioned, the hotel lay empty as recently as a decade ago, while the iconic John O'Groats signpost was partially broken in the 1990s. But given the elusive and famous status of John O'Groats across Great Britain, a lot of fantastic work has gone into reviving and modernising this area by the coast, to greet visitors who make their way all the way up to this iconic destination. Now, while I can't claim to have ever walked all the way from Land's End to John O'Groats, maybe there's a video in that in future, one of the joys of visiting John O'Groats is getting the chance to see and congratulate people who are arriving at the end of their own epic cross-country voyage, whether that be on a motorbike, a bicycle, on foot, or whatever. But despite being the ultimate goal for most journeys that traverse the length of Great Britain, John O'Groats is in no way the most northerly point on the island. So if it's not John O'Groats, then where is Great Britain's northernmost point? Well, that would be the immense windswept headland of Dunnet Head, which is located about 11 miles along the coast due west of John O'Groats. The edge of Dunnet Head extends roughly 2 miles further north than John O'Groats here, and is located just a short drive from Thurso, the largest town on Scotland's north coast. However, Dunnet Head doesn't quite have the same facilities as John O'Groats, which despite its isolation and extremity, is fairly simple to get to. You can reach John O'Groats by hopping on one of the semi-regular local bus services from either Thurso or Wick, the two main towns in Caithness. Both Thurso and Wick are easily reachable by public transport from the rest of Britain, with train stations on the famous Far North Line up from Inverness. So you can easily get to John O'Groats without a car, but if you do fancy a drive up to this point, it's absolutely worth it, as John O'Groats lies on the epic and beautiful North Coast 500 route, which follows the line of Scotland's craggy but spectacular northern coast. But after making your way all the way up to John O'Groats, what exactly is there to do when you get here? Well, apart from getting that much sought after picture by the signpost, and enjoying the gorgeous scenery across the Pentland Firth, John O'Groats is also a great place to start journeys that go even further afield. Much like Jan de Groot did when he first settled here by the coast, ferry service is still run from John O'Groats over to Orkney during the summer. The trip across the Pentland Firth to Orkney takes about 40 minutes from here, but you can stay a little closer to the Scottish mainland and take a trip out on the water with one of the regular wildlife cruises that depart from here. John O'Groats is a great place to see a lot of elusive wildlife, with the Pentland Firth home to puffins, seals, even killer whales, and so much more. But back on dry land, the building we can see before us now is said to be the oldest in all of John O'Groats, and is known rather dramatically as the Last House. The Last House was built over 300 years ago in the 17th century, and it's a small cottage that's an example of a button ben home, a historically typical Highland dwelling. The button ben is simply a 2-roomed cottage that includes a kitchen and living quarters, known as a butt, and a guest room, called a ben. When it was built, it's thought that the first residents of this house were descendants of Jan de Groot himself, but the building is now used for a rather different purpose, as the John O'Groats Brewery, a modern microbrewery that opened in 2019. Here we can see inside the brewery, which incorporates a modern visitor centre and a cosy, traditional drinking room that makes use of the Last House's button ben layout. Now back down by the coast, we're looking down the path that leads eastwards away from John O'Groats, towards Duncansby Head, which is the most northeasterly point on the British mainland. Home to a remote lighthouse, Duncansby Head is about a 2-mile walk from here, but it's also the first stage of a much longer footpath, the John O'Groats Trail, which runs 147 miles from here all the way down to the city of Inverness. Now we won't quite have time in this video to walk all those 147 miles, so let's redirect our attention to the heart of John O'Groats, where we find a variety of monuments linked to the history of the area. Here, for example, is an old foghorn that was a part of the lighthouse on Duncansby Head until the year 2000. The huge foghorn was used to protect seafarers navigating around the Pentland Firth, a stretch of water notorious for thick fog and fast currents which have claimed many lives over the years. The foghorn now stands here as a memorial to those lost out at sea in the Pentland Firth, with the lighthouse now automated to keep seafarers safe. Just beside the foghorn in this gravelled area, we find a rather interesting sculpture of an orca, otherwise known as a killer whale. This sculpture was placed here to be used as a place for people setting off on the 147-mile John O'Groats Trail to make a wish. Hence, the sculpture has been cleverly christened a wishing whale. Now, of course, the most epic route from John O'Groats is the one that covers the length of Britain down to Land's End in Cornwall. But how long does it take to travel between the 2 points? That, of course, depends on your chosen mode of transport. So let's take a look through a number of the records between Land's End and John O'Groats. According to Guinness World Records, the fastest time to cover the distance between Land's End and John O'Groats on foot was 9 days, 2 hours and 26 minutes, completed by runner Andy Rivet in 2002. Some do dispute that record, however, and an ongoing controversy as to its validity is burning to this day, though that's not something we have the time to get into here. The fastest bicycle ride between Land's End and John O'Groats, meanwhile, clocked in at just over 43 hours, completed by Michael Broadwith in 2018. Beyond that, there are countless records for cars, motorbikes, planes, kayaks, public transport, horses, and even skateboards, but I think you get the picture of just what a mammoth task travelling from Land's End to John O'Groats can be. I don't know if anyone's tried to make the 12,875-mile trip from John O'Groats to Bluff on the southern tip of New Zealand, though I'm sure someone will give it a go one day. New Zealand is located almost exactly on the opposite side of the globe from John O'Groats. If you tunnelled through the centre of the Earth from here, you'd pop out just to the south of New Zealand, and I'd guess that the weather would be pretty much the same as it is up here. Back in the Northern Hemisphere, let's return to the story of John O'Groats' links with Scandinavia, which come from a time when this region was settled and controlled by the Norse. Scandinavian presence in Scotland's far north began with Viking invasions of the region back in the 9th century, which led to wide Norse settlement right across Caithness, which eventually came to be closely associated with Norway. However, despite the Norwegians retaining de facto control over the region, and using some of its coastal towns as important ports, Caithness found itself at the heart of a murky sovereignty dispute between Scotland and Norway for many years. It wasn't until 1266 that the disputes came to an end, as Scotland and Norway signed the Treaty of Perth. The treaty marked the end of the 4-year-long Scottish-Norwegian War, and it signalled a victory for the Scots, who gained control of their entire mainland, including Caithness, as well as the Hebrides to the west of Scotland. But the treaty also confirmed Norwegian sovereignty over the Orkney and Shetland Islands to the north of Scotland, meaning that John O'Groats here lay right on the edge of a major international border in the North Atlantic. Located just 8 miles across the water from John O'Groats Harbour here, Orkney and Shetland, much further north, are now firmly a part of Scotland. But when did they switch from being under Norwegian control? The change came in the year 1472, 2 centuries after Scotland had gained control of Caithness here. Rather than the result of a conflict, Orkney and Shetland were simply transferred from Norway to Scotland, after the family of Margaret of Denmark failed to pay a dowry to her new husband, King James III of Scotland. And it was just over 20 years after that transfer of sovereignty that Jan de Groot arrived here on what would become John O'Groats, operating his ferries across the Pentland Firth to form a Norwegian territory. Jan de Groot's business was an important link between Scotland and Orkney at the time, and was established with the blessing of a royal franchise from King James IV in 1496. De Groot's ferries departed from this small harbour, developing a business that proved to be hugely profitable. In fact, his business proved so profitable that the Scottish authorities had to limit the fares he charged to the cost of 1 groat, worth about 4 pence in medieval Scotland. There's no link between the unit of currency, the groat, and Jan de Groot himself, as the groat had been used for centuries beforehand. But while it seems like an amazing coincidence, it's very likely that the story is a bit of a warped legend that seeks to explain the name of this settlement. Whatever the truth of the matter, Jan de Groot's name certainly lives on as John O'Groats, a place where his family continued to live long after he passed away. Jan de Groot was buried in the nearby Cannisby Kirk, but the ferry was operated by his descendants for another 250 years. As we mentioned, some lived in the last house, now the brewery, while the John O'Groats House Hotel, built in 1875 on the site of Jan de Groot's original house, features an octagonal design. This is said to be based on the story that de Groot, who had 7 sons, built an 8-sided house in which there stood an 8-sided table, so that no one member of the family occupied the head of the table and therefore could claim to be the head of the family and the ferry business. And as we now find ourselves back by the iconic signpost, that brings us to the end of our walk around John O'Groats. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to making a trip up to John O'Groats for yourself too.